This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We're kicking off the week with our cattle market update provided by Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. She provides insight on some of the volatility seen in the last week and the dismal outlook for grazing wheat this year in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Also ahead, with spooky season upon us, K-State field crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth shares information about 4 species of spiders that he has been getting frequent calls about: black widows, brown recluses, orb spiders, and garden spiders. We end with K-State fisheries and aquatics specialist Joe Gerken. He shares reminders on the importance of keeping leaves out of waterways this fall and better uses of those leaves, such as in compost for gardens or improving the ecology of our local forested areas. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. Today, we are back now kicking off the week with our weekly cattle market update. And joining us for that this week is Katelyn McCullock. She is the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center. Katelyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and good to hear from you, Samantha.
I think we should start off, as we always do, with a general overview of what our markets really held in the past week. So cash markets, feeder markets, things of that nature.
Well, I'll start with the feeder cattle market because that's usually the most interesting of this time of year. And so in Dodge City, Kansas, which is our respective market, usually for this program, most of the weights popped above the week ago average. So it looks like, with the exception of 4 to 5 weights and 5 to 6s. So those were below to steady in both those weight categories. But for the most part, 600 pounds and above were quite a bit higher than a week ago. 6 to 7s were about $10 higher per hundredweight. 7 to 8s gained 20, as well as 8 to 9s also were up about 20. And then 900 to 1,000 pounds was up $30 a hundredweight, and that's all for steers. So pretty interesting there. On the cash cattle side, we ended Friday on a high note. So we were above 147. The week was pretty steady. We had some 145s, 146, but, on the week, not much change there from the prior week. On the future side, we had that really big collapse a couple weeks ago. And since then, we've pretty much come back. Friday, the December live cattle contract closed at 147.8. That's a little bit below where we were maybe a few days prior to that, but holding relatively close to that cash price right now. And the October, very close to that cash price. We're approaching settlement there for that contract. On the feeder cattle side of things, the November contract had a pretty big decline on the 10th. So that was last week, Monday. And then that gained all the way back and was even quite a bit above that during the week and ended up closing pretty similar to close of last week. So on a weekly average basis, you're probably pretty similar to 2 weeks ago, but still a lot of volatility in these markets. And some of that is because of what's happened in the corn market, which has come all the way back. The newest crop production came out last Wednesday, and that gave us their first objective yield from USDA NASS, and it came in at 171.9 per bushel, I believe. So that's a steady reduction from where they were in the previous month. And the punchline is that this crop looks like it's going to continue to get a little bit smaller. They adjusted acreage and yield. And so we're probably looking at corn. LMIC has corn projections at 705 right now for the current marketing year. So we would expect that corn price to hold together pretty well through the remainder of this marketing year. We're only about 30% harvested, but they are talking about a lot of harvest being accomplished in the last week, last month or so. And so we'll continue to watch that and see how that story develops. On the meat side of things, box beef for choice ended the week at $246.98. That's about a little bit less than $1 from where from the Friday before ended. They ended at $246.07. And similar to the live steer price, it's kind of bounced around in this $245 range. Now, select box beef has been a little bit lumpier. and has probably traded about a $3 range this week, but ended the week again also on a high note of $216.94 last week.
Well, we'll cut more to the beef market side of things here momentarily, but back to kind of the cattle markets. Like you mentioned, that crop production report had a major impact on corn markets specifically just this past week, and that, of course, has led to volatility in our cattle markets as well. And Dan O'Brien, he's our grain market economist that I speak to weekly, and he's mentioned numerous times in the past several months that as we approach that one number closer and closer as the tightening continues, then, red flags kind of continue to pop up. So I know that that's also kind of similar for our wheat market, right? Maybe even more so.
So the wheat market and the play between corn and wheat can be pretty important in some years. Both are looking at relatively high prices and tight stocks. This time of year in the cattle market, especially when corn prices are very high, wheat pasture can be an ability to have some flexibility within the system. And the primary states that do that are going to be Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And in the January 1 number, there's a measure provided for how many cattle on wheat pasture. So January 1 of 2022 is about 1.7 million head. Now that's across all three states. Unfortunately, this year, Kansas and Oklahoma, that drought is really centering around pretty severe, exceptional, and extreme drought conditions, which has led to very poor pasture conditions. I believe Oklahoma was listed at 78% in the poor and very poor categories this last week. Kansas was closer to 74% and Texas at 56%. So Texas has improved a little bit from maybe where it was earlier this summer. Now, in mid-October, we also get a crop progress report that tells us how winter wheat is doing. So both what's planted and what has emerged in some of the key states. So for dual purpose wheat, we'd be looking to put cattle on probably pretty typically around November 1. Right now, that doesn't look like it's going to be able to happen. That at a minimum, it's going to be delayed, but the lack of moisture in the ground has people questioning if you're going to get it to sprout, and if you get it to sprout, if it'll grow enough to put cattle on it. And so we're looking at a pretty exceptional type of year where there might not be that ability to graze wheat at all. And we'll have to wait and see a little bit. But when we look at how much has been planted, Oklahoma was at 38% of the crop planted, which is behind last year's 48% and well behind the 5-year average of 56% for this week. In terms of winter wheat plantings for Kansas, about 50% reported planted this week compared to 60% last year and 54% on the 5-year average. Now, Texas is doing a little better, very similar to that year ago and the 5-year average. In terms of emergence, we're looking at about 19% emerged in Kansas compared to 31% its average. So quite a bit behind. Oklahoma, 20% emerged relative to the 5-year average of 29%. So it seems to me very likely that we'll delay placing cattle on wheat pasture, and then that means you're going to see those cattle end up in the feed yard at lighter weights and with very expensive corn. So usually there's a trade-off there, and right now the weather just is not cooperating. Now, you could have pockets where they get some moisture and some rainfall and it's timely and you can graze that wheat, but given the price of wheat, I think farmers are going to be pretty cautious about some of the considerations. They're going to want to protect that grain producing ability this year specifically, but there's some considerations with that as well.
And then I understand we mentioned earlier, obviously, the box beef markets, but you wanted to talk specifically about comprehensive beef and kind of what that has looked like in the last several weeks and what it really means.
So USDA releases a cutout for each quality grade, so prime, choice, select, and ungraded, as well as primals. And then they put together a blended cutout. And so we call that the comprehensive cutout, which is released weekly. And so it can be kind of interesting to see maybe more on aggregate how beef is doing, what the price implications are. And the load volumes over the last 3 weeks have been up fairly significantly. And part of that has been because we've seen a decline week over week in the last 3 weeks. So that volumes have increased about 4% in total. Now the question is, do we see cutout values continue to rise as they have in maybe the last several years? Strong beef demand has been one of the hallmarks of the last, I would say, 3 years where we've really had very strong demand, especially for quality, choice and above types of meat cuts. Now when I look at what the breakdown has been across those primal grades, we are looking at a little different environment where compared to a year ago, most of these primals are going to have some lower values than last year, and may be experiencing even week over week declines that are fairly steady. The closest comparison to a year ago is probably the prime rib primal value. So that's where, your prime rib cuts come from. And that's sitting at about 733 a hundredweight. So it's expensive. It's as expensive as last year. But everything else across all the primals in all the grades is pretty much below a year ago. And whether that generates more volume or not, I guess remains to be seen. The other nice thing about this comprehensive cutout is that it also provides a delivery breakdown of when that box beef is going to be delivered. So 0 to 21 days, 22 to 60, 61 to 90, and 91 plus. And in the last 3 weeks, there's been a 30% increase in beef delivered more than 91 days out compared to last year. So most of the sales being booked are for quite a bit further out. That could be because of time of year. It could also be there's a little bit of concern that we're going to see higher prices moving forward, which we would be in that camp. We think that beef prices will continue to increase over the next, several years in general. The shortest window had the smallest increase, only up 2%, but the 61 and 90-day window was up 20% from last year. 22 to 60 days was up 11%. So some pretty interesting dynamics happening there. In terms of loads, we did see a pretty big decline in forward contracts. Those are down 19% compared to a year ago over the last 3 weeks. Formula sales were up about 5%. I think the question remains if, especially since the prime rib primal value is what's holding steady, and we've been talking about demand a lot. What does it mean if we have continued strength in the highest quality grade and the most expensive cuts? Is that promising, or is it more a indicator of a little bit smaller prime supplies? It probably is a little bit of both. I think there is going to be a point where beef is going to see some pullback from the consumers, and pork demand has been absolutely excellent in the second and third quarter, and seems like it is finally moving more product than maybe it was earlier in the year. And so I think there is going to be some substitution between beef and other less expensive meat cuts at the retail level. But in the last retail meat sales data, which came out last week for the month of September, the aggregate pork price point is now over $5. So that's very expensive by historical standards. Still quite a bit cheaper to beef's aggregate number of over 7, and pork is quite a bit above chicken. But chicken prices have come down a lot since summer. They have just continued to decline since their peak back in about July. Week over week, we've continued to see that move lower. And so I would think chicken is very well positioned, especially if you're talking about a financially constrained consumer. But we'll have to wait and see. I did see Beyond Meat is cutting jobs, and so it doesn't appear that maybe people are substituting into those alternative protein categories.
Like you mentioned, some of the substitution that goes on there when it comes to other sources of protein, when it comes to either pork or chicken. I know consumers were frustrated, like you mentioned, when chicken kind of hit its peak in terms of price point, but like you said, kind of those balances, I guess, reaching more of a normal state is definitely going to be interesting to see how the beef market's consumers' consumption of that, how it plays out.
And every household makes choices based on their preferences on what they're willing to spend money on and what they're not, outside the grocery store as well as inside. And the truth of the matter is that the meat CPI, which also came out last week, says that meat prices, no matter what it is, on aggregate are up 10 to 12%. And that's more than aggregate inflation. And so we're probably going to see less volumes of meat protein moving overall to some extent, especially as that percent of income grows relative to paychecks. And that's something we're continuing to watch, where during the pandemic and after, we still had high savings rates. Those have pretty much come back down to normal. And you're probably looking at lower savings rates overall, as well as more credit card use and things like that.
An interesting time that we're living in for sure, and something that we'll continue to take a look at in our cattle market updates in the coming weeks and months ahead, I'm sure, as the economy continues to shift and kind of change with the times. But Katelyn, as always, thank you so much for your time this week.
Thanks, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Katelyn McCullock. She is the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, joining us for this week's cattle market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Jeff Whitworth. He is our K-State field crop entomologist. And today we're going to start with a quick PSA because you've been getting lots of questions about insecticide-treated wheat seed, whether or not producers should be using it.
Yes, thank you for having me again. I really enjoy coming over here and talking to whoever's listening out there. But it is that time of year when a lot of folks have already planted wheat and a lot of folks are anticipating planting wheat. A lot of the growers have been waiting for some moisture, and we're still waiting. It looks like we're going to be waiting for a while. But one of the common questions I've gotten is, should we use insecticide-treated wheat seed? Now, remember, I'm an entomologist, so when I talk about seed treatments, I talk about insecticides, not fungicides, because that's a whole different story, and there's a lot of research to show that fungicides do a lot more good than insecticides. Insecticides work really well, but for the most part, we don't need them in the state of Kansas yet. Now, if you're planting wheat back into wheat ground where you had a problem this past year, it might be not a bad idea to use an insecticide seed treatment. But for the most part, we don't need them. The questions I'm getting are on wheat curl mites. Should they use an insecticide treatment to help prevent wheat curl mites? As you all know, wheat curl mites vector or transmit wheat streak mosaic and aphids. There's several different aphids that they are immigrating into the state right now. They do every year this time on southern winds, and a lot of times they'll establish on new wheat. So a lot of the growers have been wondering if an insecticide seed treatment will help protect against those. They will against aphids, but only for 21 to 28 days. 3 to 4 weeks is all the protection you're going to get, for the most part, for aphids. And you don't know if you're going to have an aphid infestation or not. You know, if you're out planting your wheat now, it's going to be what? Well, who knows if we don't get any moisture, but it's going to be a couple of weeks before we get any germination. So by then, we may have several cold spells and there's no more aphids coming in, so we won't see any more till next spring. So I really do not recommend an insecticide seed treatment for wheat for aphids, and I dang sure do not recommend it for the mites because the seed treatments don't control mites. We used to use seed treatments to keep the wheat aphid-free when we were infesting with mites to do some studies. So the insecticides don't affect the wheat curl mites or the other mites that we might encounter, which we're probably going to be encountering here in another week or two. So I really do not recommend using a seed treatment for wheat this time of year. But the best thing you can do still, get rid of all the volunteer wheat. At least 2 weeks before your wheat is going to germinate. That will do the best job of getting rid of all your wheat pests, including the mites and the aphids and any of the diseases that are out there. So I really do not recommend an insecticide seed treatment for wheat as a general rule, and make sure you get rid of your volunteer in a timely fashion. And it is, right now, it's just about the ideal time, according to the best pest management planning dates for Kansas, to plant wheat. Now, hopefully we'll get some moisture in the next week or two to get it germinated and get it going, but we can't control that.
Good reminders for sure, and hopefully that alleviates some of the questions you've been getting. Another topic that we're going to focus today's conversation around is that you've been getting lots of questions about are spiders currently across the state. So you wanted to cover several different species of spiders and chat about those.
Yes, I've been getting calls about primarily 4 different species of spiders, and I'll talk about the 2 house spiders first, and that's the brown recluse and the black widow. Those are our 2 most venomous spiders in Kansas relative to humans. All spiders are venomous. I have to reiterate that every time. All spiders are venomous. They use the venom to inject into their food source, their insect prey, whatever they're feeding on, to kill the prey and liquefy the inside so that they can suck out the juice. I know that doesn't sound good, but that's what happens, okay? So all spiders are venomous. Most spiders, they don't really affect humans, but you just never know. So I always caution everybody, just don't play with spiders. Just be careful. But the brown recluse and the black widow has a neurotoxin, which affects the nervous system of animals and humans, and the brown recluse has a hemotoxin, which affects the blood cells. Both are getting ready, if they haven't already, are going into hibernation or going into a period of hiding and not moving about very much from now until about March. So one of the questions I've been getting is, should I have my house sprayed, for brown recluse spiders or black widow spiders? Number one, a general spray doesn't do a real good job for brown recluse spiders or black widows. It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't do a real good job. But from now until March, they're not going to get into the spray anyway, because they're all going to be pretty much immobile, hidden someplace, tucked away, out of sight, out of mind, where they're going to just spend the winter. That's the brown recluse. The black widow, I saw some still active in webs the last weekend, but also they're on their way going into overwintering mode, which means they're going to leave their webs and they're not going to be subject to getting into an insecticide or they're not going to cause any problems between now and March anyway. So we really do not recommend treating house spiders, i.e. brown recluse and black widows, from mid-October to mid-March. And that's the generalization, but you have about 6 months there where they're not active, they're not feeding. It just doesn't do any good to treat for them. Now, the other two spiders I've been getting a lot of calls about, these are more field type or agricultural type spiders that growers are running into as they're out scouting for sorghum or soybeans or whatever. And one of them is the orb spider. This is a big brown bulbous type spider. They build really nice webs. That's why they're called an orb weaving spider. They build nice intricate webs. A lot of times you go out and you don't see the spider in the web. You just see the webbing, because the spiders generally leave in the morning and they go hide. They leave the webbing up there. The webbing will catch insects, and they'll come out in the evening. They'll go out there and they'll feed on whatever they've caught in the webbing. So most of the time when you run into an empty web, it's not that the spider is dead or the spider has left. They're just hiding for the day, and they'll be back at night. That's one of the questions I get. Well, I've been out there 2 or 3 days. There's no spiders, but the spider webbing is still intact. That's because they come out and repair it at night. Then they use it at night, and then they go hide during the day. The garden spider, the big common dark green or black and yellow garden spider, the one with the long legs, this is the one that a lot of growers run into when they're walking between fields, because they'll use corn or sorghum or large weeds to build their webs. They build large webs, and these spiders will actually still be hanging out there all day, generally upside down, but they're just hanging out there to try and catch prey, insects, whatever walks through there. These webbings of both the orb weaver and the garden spider are sticky, so they get all over you. The spider can get on you. One of the common questions, can they bite? Do they bite? Yes, and yes. Mostly they're not going to. We always say they're more scared of you than you are of them, but that's not always true in some cases. Some people are really scared of these spiders, and they are pretty large. They can bite, and I've had a couple of students get bitten, and they said it's kind of like a bee sting or getting a sticker, with no problems later on. But I'm just saying, I would not take a chance on them. Just leave them alone. They are actively catching prey, catching other insects, stuff like that. But the reason we're seeing more of them is because they've been small and they've been growing all year long, and now they're at the adult stage, and so that they're largest. They need larger webbing that way. They're trying to catch food, and they're eating the food, and they're laying eggs for overwintering purposes. So you're going to see attrition take its toll. You're going to see the numbers start diminishing in the next week or two. If temperatures get down into the upper 20s, the mid-20s, for the most part, they will go away. Now, some of the orb weavers, if they're around houses, they have nice big webbing around houses, they can crawl in a crack or a crevice, and they may not go away as quickly as some of the field spiders do. And they will go away, because they're only going to live another 2 or 3 weeks, and then they're going to overwinter as eggs. The other common question I get about the brown recluse and the black widow is do they just live 1 year? No, a brown recluse will live at least 3 years. We've kept them in our colonies for 3 years. The black widow's the same thing. They'll live 2 or 3 years. A lot of black widows are misidentified when they're small, because a black widow is not black. When they first come out of the egg, they're brown. And they can be brown all the way up until that last molt. And then the last molt, they become that nice, shiny black characteristic color with the red that we're used to seeing, and the males aren't. They're smaller and they're different colored also. But we're about ready to run out just before Halloween of being scared by spiders because the adults are going to go away and they're going to lay their eggs, and the eggs are going to not cause any problems. The brown recluse and the black widow, they're pretty much, if they haven't already, they're pretty much on their way going into hibernation. So they're becoming inactive for the winter, and they won't be back until March or April.
Well, good to know. I know we have quite a few publications on some of these different spiders that we've talked about today, so I'll link some of those if people are looking for more information in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Jeff, as always, thank you so much for your insight.
Yes, my pleasure.
Once again, that was Jeff Whitworth. He is our K-State field crop entomologist. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending today's programming with our wildlife segment, as we always do. And joining us to cover it this week, we have with us Joe Gerken, our K-State fisheries and aquatics specialist. So, Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So, today I understand you want to talk about leaves. Obviously, changing of seasons is happening. They're starting to fall, and then the relationship with water quality.
Yeah, so this is a really fun time of year, all the pretty colors in the trees, but then those leaves go from the trees into waterways. So that can have some effects. Thought we'd chat about that for a couple minutes.
Absolutely. And I think we've mentioned this, in brief moments on the show before, but it's really the sedimentation process that's the concern here, right?
Yeah, so sedimentation and then nutrients. One of the big things we've definitely mentioned before is that ponds all want to be prairies. That's their life goal, right? And one of the ways they can do that is to trap leaves. Those leaves break down, and that adds to the sediment in your pond. So over time, if the leaves aren't taken care of, that can start to fill in your pond and become an issue. So we definitely want to control them so that our ponds don't fill in over time.
Absolutely. And you hinted at another reason there, the nutrient component of it, which we've obviously talked about as an issue before. But let's go ahead and explain leaves specifically.
Sure. So leaves are a big part of the nitrification process. So they tend to add nitrogen to our waterways when they get broken down by bacteria. So just like if you put them in a big pile in your backyard, they'll break down over the winter, and a lot of people add them to their gardens. That same thing's going to happen in a pond or a stream. And so if it happens in a pond or a stream, it generally leads to calls down the road because there becomes too many weeds or too much algae. So if we take some time this fall to kind of take care of our leaves or remove as many of them as we can from our pond, that can really help us with the maintenance and the pond weed issues that we might see next spring and summer. So just thinking ahead and preparing a little bit now to prevent some problems in the future.
Absolutely. And it's not just in our ponds directly that we should be worried about this. I understand, obviously, they get in roadways, and that can cause issues too.
Yeah, and so one of the things that's common this time of year is people rake all their leaves into the roadways. And we need to remember that those impervious streets a lot of times are connected to sewer systems that lead into streams, rivers, or potentially ponds. And so making sure that we're only putting leaves into the roadway when we know that it's collection day or very close to collection day is really smart. So if it's not just being at the pond itself or the river itself, it's also what we're doing when we're at our homes in town that can really affect the water quality.
Absolutely. A good reminder for sure. And some alternatives for these leaves, if people tuning in are going to end up collecting them, what can they do with them instead of just throwing them into the street or trashing them?
Sure. So in your yard, the best thing to do is to mulch them up. And so you want to chop them up until they're dime-sized or smaller pieces. Microbes, macroorganisms like worms can help break them down. And those nutrients really help our lawns. They help the ecology. If you're out in a big prairie or pasture, letting them lie and break down can be beneficial to the native grasses there. If you want to collect them from your yard and take them to a forested area, they can really help the ecology and the critters that live in the forest there too. So a few options. Start with your lawnmower if you're in town. Chop them up. Let's also make sure when we're chopping them up, we're not blowing all the grass and the leaves back into the roadway, like we said, just talked about. So that could wash into a watershed and be a problem. So chop them up, leave them there.
Absolutely. You mentioned gardening, too. I guess this is another way it could be used. Could you potentially take these leaves to your compost pile if you're a composter?
Yeah, that's a great idea, too. And so, they are a lot of the brown material that we need. So they can help to break down. They provide a really rich nutrient source. So composting them and then having them for next spring for your garden, that's really good to think ahead.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, if anybody's tuning in and they're looking for some more resources in terms of maintaining their ponds, where can they find that at?
Sure. So always reach out to your local extension agent. That's a great place to start. Master Gardeners has a lot of resources. The Kansas Forestry Service is also a great resource. And as always, if it involves critters, reach out to me or Drew. We're happy to help.
Absolutely. Well, we can't thank you enough for your time today, Joe, and for this update on maintaining leaves and how it connects to pond qualities.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Joe Gerken. He is our K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.